Hello and welcome to the latest edition of How Might We? And this time we're talking about how might we build trust internationally? And at the time we are, I think that's a very interesting subject. And with me on this podcast is one of my regular guests, Geoff, another Douglas who's been on many times. And for the first time, and welcome, is Fahd. Welcome to the podcast, gentlemen. Who would like to introduce themselves first?
I think Fahd should introduce himself first.
Okay, there we go. Please, Fahd.
All right. So thank you for having me onto the podcast. My name is Fahad, and I'm the CEO of two companies. One is Mohsin, and the other is Muhafiz. Muhafiz is a private 911 service or a private 999 service. In third world countries, you typically don't have very efficient systems that work. So I had to make a private 999 solution for the people of Pakistan. And through this company, we've helped save more than 15,000 lives and handle more than 55,000 events globally. The other company is Mohsin. Mohsin is very relevant to the topic today because Mohsin is all about helping expat and overseas Pakistanis look after their families back home and making sure that they're looked after, safe, provided for, and everything. The typical challenge that we're trying to address is establishing trust with the people who are sitting outside of Pakistan. They're looking for a service provider who'll basically look after their families like a surrogate child. So you can imagine nobody wants a stand in unless they can trust them. So it's very relevant to the topic today.
Okay, thank you very much and welcome. So, Douglas, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Scott, and it's wonderful to see everybody again. And Fahd, just amazing what you're doing in that region, and looking forward to having the conversation together today. And thank you, Scott, for including me. As I said, my name is Douglas Lyons. I'm a co-founder and director of RBM Group Limited, based in London, and have been so for a number of years. And Geoff and I are business partners and good friends, as yourself, Scott, and Fahd. So I think this is a collection of amazing people, but amazing friends, where there's real trust. So really looking forward to a wonderful conversation from all the perspectives this afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much. And last but not least, Jeffrey.
Thank you, young man. Geoff Hudson-Searle, independent non-executive director for the last 20 years on global technology companies, senior executive, C-suite executive on both publicly listed and privately listed companies, author of 7 books, regular thought leader, and also co-founder and director with Douglas, as I said, on IBM Group and group of companies.
Okay, welcome, gentlemen. We're going to talk today about how might we build trust internationally, which I think with the way that's going on, especially geopolitically and trade-wise, is quite an interesting topic. And as far as you said, even in business, how do we build trust internationally, especially the business you're doing with looking after people, expats or people abroad, and then they're trusting you to deliver services and things from afar, from a distance.
I think one of the things that we trust is a very expansive, very overreaching sort of a word, but it is so fundamental in nature. It starts from almost childbirth, where a child is brought into the world and he grows up in the cradle in the arms of people that he grows up trusting. And when you look at children, for the first 4 or 5 years of their lives, they're very trusting people, and somehow along the way, the world sort of starts taking that away. It starts chipping away at all of those things. And I think one of the major things that we would want to discuss today is how do we raise a whole society and then through that create a system where trust can be established along all lines, so that when a child or a person finally reaches into the business realm or into adult life, they're people who other people can actually trust.
Interesting. I like the concept you said about as a child, we basically trust, and it's nearly unconditional, isn't it? The amount we trust our children. Also, our children trust us as parents, and we trust our parents or guardians. And so the experience that we have erodes that level of trust we have as human beings. Doug, what do you?
I guess it depends also how you were brought up. Everyone has a different story in that regard. So trust can be broken at a very young age. Trust can be broken at a teenager level, or even at an adult level, right? When you think about it. So you are engaging in different experiences in your life journey, if you think about that.
Yep. Doug?
When you start talking about this, I like to talk about things from a different perspective. And you'll remember the mid-90s in business, where in England particularly, you would have the Queen's Export Award for companies that were looking to export their products and services globally and internationally. And there were very few companies really doing that very well. I remember working for a company that did it well and continually won this award. But it was an unusual one because it was a case of, in England, there were a lot of companies that were afraid to do international business. I was never afraid of that, and always looked to take our products and services across country, across culture, and across boundary, when it was a very primitive thing to do. You know, we've just won a contract in the United States, or we've just won a contract in Africa, we've just won a new contract in Malaysia or Japan or in China. In the 90s, that wasn't really happening. And then things started to evolve. I mean, I've worked in 121 countries around the world successfully in my career to date. Enjoyed it. But what was the fascination for me was that I am English and I had the ability to be able to go cross-border, cross-culture. And what you understand, even at that level in the mid-90s, was you were not going to succeed with that unless you built collaboration, unless you built trust. We are failing on those points. And if you look at, we've talked about this before, Scott, but if you think about what is the process of trust, it starts with effective listening. Doug and I, we do a lot around empathy mapping. We do a lot around why you need to have what creates a curious mind, but more importantly, what is compassion? And then when you start leading compassion, you start bringing into understanding, and then you start moving into communication, which then obviously builds outcome, which builds purpose and trust. Now, if you start looking at what creates the curious mind, you can have as many curious minds as you want. But unless you have the ability to engage, and right now I would say we're at the worst point in the world's history for the ability to engage. Productivity issues have never been so disastrous than what they are today. 8.8 trillion at the last count with a Gallup report, which is about 11% of GDP, which is more than Amazon, Apple, and Google's turnover all put together. Houston, do we have a problem? I think we have. No, old jokes aside, and I know Douglas has got some very strong points that he'd like to add to this, but I do think that if we look at what we were doing in the 90s, and I think it was our famous Winston Churchill, and it was, I must add this, walked into a meeting, and they said, one of the persons said, do we have a conclusion yet on the war? And he said, well, I don't think it's going to last more than 5 days. Why do you say that? Well, we've only got 5 bottles of Pol Roger on the side, and that would say to me that Winston wants a conclusion in 5 days. And I would say right now, we need a conclusion when it comes to war. We've got massive problems geopolitically. War is not helping trust, it's actually fragmenting our relationships, international relationships, our ability to actually communicate with others, because everything is so transactional. And you know, and I know that transactional relationships have a very short lifespan when it comes to longevity. Anyhow, I've said enough. I want to open up now. Douglas.
Thank you, Geoff. I was deeply reflecting on both your comments and Fahd's as you were talking there. And the other night I was talking to Monique, my wife, and we were just talking about when we were growing up as kids, if we wanted to get something in terms of information, we would have to wait a week or two in the postman or a telefax or something like that. But we look at the instant nature of the way the world communicates, and where a president can tweet on his own personal social media site instantaneously before the news gets to it. It's just unbelievable. And I think it brought me back to an experience I had many years ago when I was blessed to spend some time with a world famous National Geographic photographer. And he had a simple philosophy in life. And he said, we tend to focus and we look at the world around us, and the media tends to focus on very negative things. But he said when he took photographs and you would look at a particular picture at a distance, you saw one thing, but when you went closer, you saw something totally different. And it's to celebrate what is right with the world. And unfortunately, we're in a pervasive environment where we celebrate what's wrong with the world predominantly. And so it tends to be sensationalism. It tends to sell links, clicks, advertising online, etc., etc. And I think that's something that when we look at trust internationally, and it's those things that we need to be better at celebrating what's right with the world, because there is a lot more good. And I think there's a lot more good than there is bad. We just tend to overemphasize the bad, and it tends to have a voice that's much bigger than it should be. And it's how do business leaders, how do communities start to celebrate what is right with the world? And I think that can have a big impact on a number of things. And I think coming back to Fahd's point is that as we grow up and we indoctrinate ourselves in a certain way of life and we get shaped, we lose inhibition around free thinking and natural thinking because we start to be educated in a certain way and influenced in a certain way. And I think these are the types of things that, again, when we look at the role of leaders and communities and business circles, how we can make a difference is to actually start celebrating what is right with the world, what is right with doing amazing collaboration deals across borders, knowing that some of these borders are complex as well. So just some thoughts from my side.
I think what Douglas has just said is phenomenal. I really agree with the fact that, unfortunately, news of bad events, the type of stuff that you see the most traction for. And I've seen that happen. So I've seen the advent of media from one TV channel back in the 90s to having a full spectrum of TV channels, and then having the internet boom come in into Pakistan where you have the lowest data packages. I've seen how it's eroded trust in society, where last year 1.6 million, the record, 1.6 million people have tried to leave the country. And it's not, if you look at the statistics on the ground, yes, crime has picked up, but it's no different from the crime statistics that you see in the UK for London. It's no different from the crime that you see in New York or any of these other places. The grass is not really greener anywhere. It's not. The weather might be different. The weather might be more pleasant for you guys. The summer is nice for us. The winter is something that we really look forward to. But when you look at it, brick for brick, word for word, pound for pound, I think life everywhere has gone south. And Jeff made a very powerful point that, and I know Jeff, having been a friend of his for, it's been a privilege to be a friend of his for the past at least 15 years now. He's been very, very, his tolerance for risk has been very, very high. The perceived risk has been very high. He was one of the first people to come to Pakistan when Pakistan was going into an economic boom. He brought this entire team over. And one interesting thing that I was thinking about when Jeff started speaking, so Pakistanis have like people in the subcontinent or even in the Middle East have a very large ability to trust foreigners. You look at any vlogger coming to Pakistan, and you'll see that the amount of hospitality that they receive is just through the roof, right? Because for some odd reason, it's like we will trust what a foreigner says, especially if there's a little bit of a colonial history there, but we tend to take them as experts. But it's very surprising to think that trust is a major factor for a lot of UK firms to push their business back into these markets where it should be happening. It shouldn't evoke conversations on trust. Yes, it should evoke a lot of other conversations, a lot of compliance and regulatory conversations. But as a Pakistani sitting in Pakistan, I've always seen that anybody coming in who's a foreigner, and Jeff, you've been here, you've seen the amount of hospitality
Sure.
that you received in Pakistan, right? I personally feel that the world, as connected as it has gotten to be, it has gotten very fragmented in the process. And I think the basic thing has been what Douglas said, focusing on the negatives.
Well, yeah, I think so. I think you're right about the Pakistan. I mean, look, I was very honored to be in Pakistan at a particularly interesting time of its development. But you also remember it wasn't just the hospitality; it was the protection that you provided for me. Armed guards and 4x4s and safe houses, etc., was was very high, as were some of the risks. So you have to weigh that in. But also, I'd say that, yeah, from a culture perspective in the Middle East, particularly, and we're seeing it now in UAE, and I'm spending quite a bit of time out there at the moment, is that they like international knowledge, international intellect. They want to employ international people. Funny enough, I was with a very large law firm in London recently discussing that all her clients that were racing over to Dubai to set up a business and operate out of Dubai, and now they're racing back to London. And I can only think that people don't recognize, and they need to recognize. And I think trust is a big part of this. And I'll come back to that shortly. But culture in an environment has to be understood, and you have to integrate yourself. Dubai, as an example, is not an extension of London. It's Dubai, UAE. Yes, it has an international metropolis of culture speaking expat communities, people wanting to do business, but it's still the UAE and the Middle East. It is not London. And I think a lot of English companies have made that mistake. I think when it comes to trust, it's a difficult word. Broadly speaking, you have to be careful as well. There's certain labels attached to this. The trust modeling is that we want to rebuild trust in business. Is something that I'm seeing more of now, rather than we need to build trust because they're feeling, don't you trust me? That we've got to be very careful that trust is an output of cognitive behavior. But really, where I look at this is it's a series of intelligences that we all possess, and it's the umbrella that encapsulates all of those. Now, when I start talking about those intelligences, I start talking about IQ intelligence, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, for a better word, values-based intelligence, if you want to call it that, wisdom intelligence. And trust has to be the umbrella that we all carry in order to, because it's not just your presence, it's the way you speak, it's how you communicate. You could question how we were communicating before if you weren't, or we weren't prepared to actually listen to people meaningfully with depth. When I meet people now, it's not just a conversation. The absolute transparency and openness and depth that we go to gives me trusted recognition straight away. When you're only speaking at a very thin layer of discussion, you realize you've got to earn your respect and earn your respect. Now, finally, that doesn't necessarily come from the different generations. So the older generation understands that very well. The younger generation isn't interested. It's like, now I want it now. They don't understand that how you build trust and how that's, and more importantly, what is the importance of that. As an example, you can go for a walk in a park. It's an analogy, basic analogy. And you can walk past them and say, good morning, sir. Good morning, madam. And you have a lovely dog. Go through to a younger person, generally the facial expressions will be head down, headphones on, potentially, and not even interested. They were not even interested in basic forms of etiquette. But you and I know that basic forms of etiquette builds a much bigger common language when it comes to culture and understanding.
It's interesting, and we talk about this. We touched on some of it, like the culture, and said when people come over and the respects that is the foreigners who come over are given. One of the best things I've heard somebody say about trust is how people experience you. Now, I think if we're going to build it internationally and across borders, is how do we project as a business or as a country? What are we projecting, and then how do people experience that projection? Because that will influence their perception of us as a collective or as an individual, and then that's how will influence how they will respond to us. So I think we've got to be really mindful internationally, and it comes back to what you're saying, Geoff, sorry, about the UAE and Dubai. And I've spent a lot of time in and around the GCC area, and every part of the GCC has its own identity. It's a bit like thinking, oh, it's all the same because it's GCC, it's all the same because it's the Arab world, wherever. So, well, it's not, Europe's not all the same.
Mm.
No,
Every country in
Absolutely.
Europe
Mm-hmm.
has its own identity in its own way. Yes, there's a shared
Actually,
language.
if we can talk about that, Doug. Sorry, Scott.
Yeah, Doug, you just kept mentioning everything. Everyone obviously wants to talk to you, don't they?
You know, that was the toughest job I ever had. I worked internationally across 4 or 5 continents for many years. But when I took a C-suite role in Europe, I ran 28 countries, Middle East and Africa, and it was the toughest job I ever had, integrating that and having that interconnectedness between all the countries and the office and their regions, right? Toughest job. However, yeah, we got there and we made it hugely successful. But it was the toughest job I had. But without the empathy, compassion, understanding of the country, the regional aspects, the nuances. Okay, an example of that would be we had to have different messaging for different countries in the local language, which went to the target minds of the people for the very first time, and suddenly started to build credibility from that, right? And we started to really make great headway, but it was tough. And I think I go back to culture, and where do we look for trust around us? Geopolitically, we had 80 plus elections last year. 80 plus, massive shift in movement. All of the politicians say, I want you to trust me. But when we look at that, we would always look to government as trust on how we behave, or even not trust, maybe respect and how we behave. Businesses, I don't trust, there's a lack of trust in government, which means that businesses have to create their own miniature cultures. For the youngsters, they might look to ambassadors, so football ambassadors, and you've got to look around you and say, even in the world of sport, there is an erosion of behavior, which really brings back the issue. Well, if they can do it, we can do it. In government, if they can behave this way, we can behave this way. And this is a big problem. And as I said, we can ban the word culture, but and you can use that as the umbrella. But there's an awful lot of fixing to be done, and even at home, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever connotation, wife, husband. When one person picks up a device, the other person's thinking, "Well, it's 8 o'clock at night. Who are you contacting? Who are you talking to?" There is still a mistrust even at home. So, in my view, there's an awful lot of fixing to be done, but it's not a task that's too big because it starts today. And what we do today matters because whatever we do today will affect tomorrow.
I have this conversation can get very expansive when Scott was speaking, and then when Geoff, again, from a Pakistani perspective, for us to trust a foreigner, especially a Britisher, is easier because we've grown up on the culture that was left behind. When I started reading English, in Pakistan, the lingua franca is English. Your chance at upward mobility greatly increases if you converse better in English than any other language, even the local languages. So when I started reading, I consumed Enid Blyton. The children of today can consume Harry Potter. I grew up on W.E. Johns, Captain's Bigglesworth, and Charles Dickens and whatnot, right? So for us, there was a lot of subliminal level acceptance for doing this. There was a lot more acceptance for us. And I always say this, like when you come to India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, you will find that having been part of the colonies, because Lord Macaulay and all of his attempts to basically introduce this new culture where the English language was superior. Like there's a very small example in our language. The word jamadar is the word that you use for a janitor, which isn't really like a top-end job anywhere in the world, right? In the olden days, like before the British took over, jamadar was the person who used to do all of the accounting. So it was a complete cultural shift, and we got independence from the British. The Indians got independence from the British. But if you look at the Middle East, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but if it was a Pakistani doctor or an Indian doctor or a Bangladeshi doctor, a professional, they would get 15,000 reals or 20,000 reals, whereas a Britisher would start off at 80,000 reals. And the difference in the Middle East is they didn't get independence from you. They got independence from the Turks through you. there's a lot of subliminal trust in this market. But if you take this conversation down to a very basic element, because, and Geoff, I'll be very clear with you on this. You just spoke about the youth and wearing headphones and everything. I think just one generation above us, we've done something very fundamentally wrong. We've somehow subliminally put in a programming with the children that they're not to trust the world around them. We've also at a very micro level done this. Like I see it. A lot of the people that sign up for our services. Like I'll give you an example. I was taking my parents out for ice cream and coffee at night, and
Look, Fahd, you're talking broadly. There's 4 of us on the call, which says 25% of us on this call today don't have children, i.e. me.
okay, 25% of the call, I understand, but I'm talking about 100% of my customers. I'll give you that example where, so what are you
Oh, and,
asking these?
and I'll add one more metaphor here, and that is, if you look, I had this conversation yesterday, if you actually look at procreation of children globally, there are less children being conceived and coming into the world.
Not in Pakistan.
Yeah,
There's just there.
no, globally.
Where
I'm
do?
thinking,
Yeah,
if you take all the global stats, and I'm sure if I look at Africa, that's still booming too, right? And then but if you look at certain countries, the figures are down.
So, Geoff, you're absolutely right. But if you want to look at the growth of population, you'll soon realize that Europe is going to be largely Muslim because Muslims are procreating at a different rate than what the natives are, right? At some point, you're going to see a very major reverse. Like I used to say, and I say this very often, there was a time I was telling Scott this, that I spent about 6 months in Shrewsbury. My father was doing his basic helicopter course, instructor pilot course in Shrewsbury, right? And there was a time in England where you used to literally have to look for places for curry and all of those back in 87, 88, right? And now, recently when I was in the UK, I did not have to speak English.
I had curry last night, and I'm in North America. Curry is the national dish of England.
Yeah.
It has become so, hasn't it?
I love curry.
What I'm trying to say is, Geoff, that the world is changing in a way where in London now I don't need to speak in English because every shop that I go to, I can converse in Urdu. And I jokingly say this to people: when the British left the subcontinent, they didn't think we'd follow them. That's what happened. But the thing is, Geoff, how do we build a culture? How are you and I friends? We've been friends because we've always had each other's back.
You will remember in 2010 when we drove through the Taliban village before sunrise to go to that big oil refinery. Yeah. And you said, I'm not going without you. You remember that? That's your statement. You said, I'm not leaving without you, was your words. And so what I'm really trying to say is, if you take that as an output of behavior, that builds trust and it builds credibility. If you look at the military, trust, respect, honor, these are big words. These aren't just words. They are built on practices. If I say to Douglas, I'm going to make sure this happens, Douglas doesn't have to ask me twice. It's done because it's the trust that we have together. And Scott, so forth, everybody on this call, we have a phenomenal relationship that we know that even if something happens, that each and every person has done their utter best to do that, because it's credible actions that build trust. As you said earlier, the human experience is built about this incremental trust. Our trust model explains that in a lot more detail. But really what I'm trying to say to you is that the human experience needs to be about more interaction, more execution,
experiences,
experiences. And we lack human experiences. My God, I can't wait to get off this thing because I relish the ability to have human experience. I say to Doug sometimes, Doug, meet me in so-and-so. We're going to have a day together and we are just going to sort everything out. And we do, because it's human experience, not video experience. Now, as I said before, the whole thing that research proves that if we have a call like this today, from a creativity point of view or an innovation point of view, we'll create something like 6.47 ideas. But actually, if we're all together in a room, the creativity and innovation and idea exchange moves to something like 11.3. Now, as far as I'm
Absolutely.
concerned, that is the difference between success and failure in my book, especially when you're doing mission critical decisions, whether it's a business, whether it's a family issue, whether it's a taxation or government issue. These are the things that have to be considered, and we're not spending enough time in the human experience.
I think also, Geoff,
I was about to say, Doug, you've been
yeah, no. I've been
quietly reflecting on the
listening,
conversation. Now
and
you can participate.
percolating. Thank you, Scott. But for me, it's about action, and I want to share a story. You know, being from South Africa originally, I was in the pre-apartheid era as a young white South African at school, and I wouldn't say I was privileged because we came from a very humble background, and we lived a very humble life, but we were also lived in a sheltered life and a segregated life, which was absolutely wrong. And when we came out of apartheid, the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was I actually went to a predominantly black university, which was an absolute 2 years before that would have been an absolute unacceptable thing. But it was the best thing for me because it just changed my whole perspective on people and people, white people, black people, Indian people. And to this day, I've got wonderful friendships. But one of the most amazing things in my life, and talking about leadership, was one event that changed a country. One event, one action, no words, one action changed a country in a minute. And that was the day when we came out of apartheid, and Nelson Mandela was chosen to be our president. And he walked out. And rugby, as you guys know, is one of our passions in South Africa. He came out with the Springbok jersey on. And in that moment, he united 65 million people. And I guarantee you, and it wasn't just in that moment, when he was the ruling president of South Africa, it was truly a rainbow nation. It was a nation that was coming together, it was building amazing things that had mutual respect for each other. And it's certainly, even to this day, it's not a racist country at all, even though some think it is. It's absolutely not. People just want to survive like we all do. For me, unfortunately, when toxic leadership takes over, then you see the unwinding of all that good work. And so I'm really fascinated about is the behavior of public officials, public policy versus private capital. And there was an example where actually through a horrific regime, we brought a leader who actually aligned the public policy and private capital rallied behind as one. And actually it was South Africa at that point was on an absolute amazing trajectory. And so for me, unfortunately, it wasn't sustainable, and hopefully it does get back there. But that's a great example of just this alignment between public policy and private capital and how they can coexist. And I think what we are seeing now, and Fahd touched on it, is this exacerbation, and it's a mega trend, is mass migration of people from war-torn areas, from areas, and some are doing it legitimately, some aren't, but it is becoming a boiling point globally, rightfully or wrongfully. Are the press stirring it up? They absolutely are. We've got a migrant concern issue now at the moment, and I was chatting to someone who's done a tremendous amount of work in the United Nations on this, and saying, well, actually, people don't realize the volumes were double this in the 80s and 90s. So this has been around for a long time, but what is it? It's that voice in the corner of the media that tends to blow it out of proportion, and clearly there's certain agendas in that. But the other thing I want to touch on is, I think in all our careers and life experiences, when we've been in tough corners together, and so Fahd and Geoff, when you guys were in Pakistan in some tough situations, you had each other's back. And that's what counts. That's what builds lifelong trust. And it's how do we bring that in business, in society, in relationships with the younger generations to show them sometimes it's just those simple things of having each other's back. And that's all that you count on. And that's what makes the difference. So just some thoughts on my side on that.
Thank you very much. I like it's kind of, as you got I think it's Gottman's definition of trust, which is another one I like. Is basically, are you there for me at this moment?
Mm.
And so trust is contextual, and it does change because you trust people in different ways. And I think it goes back to what your point, Doug, about all the stuff that's in the papers and the information that you have. So I think one thing that is missing for us as people is we read the headlines and we don't look at the detail a lot of the time. So we say, "Oh, we've got a migrant problem. We've got more than we've got more than we've had." And he said, "Well, actually, the 80s, 90s, we had more." Or say, "This is the worst." Oh, actually, there's more people. We've actually dig down into the details and get some facts and work on facts and figures. Because what you tend to see now is, I've never seen it before, is now you've got news agents, news outlets, fact checking information that institutions that we should trust are pushing into the public domain. Why are we having to fact, there was a C in there. Why are we fact checking information that we should be trusting these institutions? They should be telling us the truth. And
Because it's become sensationalist, and sensationalism has really paid. All of this, there's a news channel in Pakistan. It's one of the biggest news channels in Pakistan. If you hear the music that they have, right, it is anxiety inducing to a level that you wouldn't believe. It's you cannot mistake it, but that sensationalism works for them. The only thing is, the one the one thing that I say to people in Pakistan, if you for a week turn off your news sources, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, whatever, right? Turn off your news sources, turn off Twitter, turn off whatever, you'll actually start looking at your neighbors like humans again. You will stop looking, you'll be looking at people as human beings again, and not just as bad statistics. You won't be looking at things at the bad in the world. When we were growing up, we had a world which like I wouldn't trade my childhood for anything. But if I look at my children, the way they've grown up, my son just turned 18 yesterday and my daughter's 13. Part of my day is spent just worrying about if they made it home from school okay or not. And they're perfectly fine. They live in a very safe place. They go to a good school. They go to a good place. But all you hear about is acts of intolerance, acts of hate, and it pollutes your mind. If there has to be a trust building activity, I think people in the media have to become very, and people on social media also have to become very, very sensible about what they're talking about. Scott, and you've come up with very good nuggets of inputs in this conversation. One of the major things that we don't notice is nobody is willing to fact check. Nobody is willing to go inside and do deeper research. Like, we've gotten hostage to 360 characters or whatnot, right? And that headline's good enough for us. But going to Douglas's point, and I think Mr. Mandela is one of the best examples of how to bring a country together. That it was actually pretty well immortalized in that movie Invictus, where you saw the effort that he would put in from his within his own community as well, to show them that this was the past. Can you imagine the amount of forgiveness it took a person who'd spent the majority of his life in jail at the hands of a certain people, and to come out and say, okay, today is zero, we start and we rebuild. And but if you look at the world right now, do you see how much suffering we have? Do you like, and it's all of these things. It's the fear of the known compounded by statistics that nobody's fact checked. It's just creating a level of hysteria which is very different. The
I,
real
I,
question is, how do we build trust in this environment?
I think you make a very valid point. As an example, when you start looking at data, we've got a lot of what I would say is the data quality that we have is generally not that great. It's not necessarily clean, and therefore, if you put data into something and you expect AI and or quant to actually give you data and analysis and points, it's going to give you data which you can't make necessarily a very good informed decision on, whether you're a board of directors, whether you're in a business. And we don't have people at the intellectual capacity for competency to be able to challenge that data, because they don't have the upskilling, they don't have necessarily the right skills, they don't have a learning environment or learning culture, knowledge tree, knowledge culture environment where we're learning fast enough, and technology is faster than human development in this area, which is a technical problem. If the data was making better decisions, which enriches our life and enriches the processes and efficiencies of what we do and how we do it, and even to a point of compassion and experiential, we'd be in a different place. So you've got parallel lines working, saying, well, I've got this data, but how much do I trust this? What's my data trust on this? Because, or do I have no choice but to accept this data because I haven't got any other ability to challenge this to make a better decision? That's one thing. Like an example, you could have a AI bot on this interview today taking notes. Doesn't necessarily mean it will give you the depth of what we're discussing today, and that all forms into the experience. So there has to be some radical change around the way we receive information, receive data. And I still believe that, and Doug and I have spent a lot of time with this doing design-led thinking innovation, but we always, always, always put people at the center. Why? Because we understand the value of psychological safety and well-being and trust around. We put that together with technology and then grow, you pivot. And the companies that have done that have proved that they've pivoted. So I think there's it's an expansive subject. There's no question about that, but that hasn't helped and that isn't helping. Technology is outpacing the data, and the data isn't trusted, and the data doesn't always correlate to real life situations that people can make better decisions on.
That's a good point about data.
I think, Geoff, I think on that topic, it's something when we know we're scratching the surface in terms of ethics around AI, and as you said, quantum, that's around the corner. And I don't think any of us really deeply appreciate what that impact is going to be, and we're still figuring that out. And I think the scary thing is we're the ones that are probably more in the know than most. So because of what we get exposed to, but it does tell you that the world out there is incredibly uneducated around the impact of these things. And you couple that with the big unicorns, social media houses, and they prey on your data, they prey on your human emotion, and that's how they make their money is through that deep neuroscience understanding of your world and influencing that rightfully or wrongfully. And I think this is coming back to Fahd's. When our daughter was 13, she was going on 18. So Fahd, I can tell you now, you've got two 18-year-olds there, even though your daughter's 13, as the girls tend to grow up faster. But the influences that the young people have and have got access to, it's that they're far more exposed to it far more quicker than when we were growing up. Talking about, Fahd, you mentioned the cherished childhoods, and we all reminisce on those simple days. We didn't have all this technology and corresponding stress. So it is something it's becoming enormously complex to navigate through this, both generationally, technology-wise, public policy-wise, politics, geopolitics-wise. It's becoming more and more complex. And I still come back to that, what you say, Geoff, is that human-to-human interaction and being there for each other. And that whether it's in business, whether it's in your personal relationships, cross borders. And I think you and Fahd are a great example of lifelong trusted friends and partners through some tough times together. So that's what we need more of, in as many aspects as we can.
Can I just something I just want to add to that? So okay, and it comes back to what we're saying about human and Fahd. I like what you said. If we just take away the inputs that we have are outside of our community, it helps us look at our community differently as human beings. And one of the things that we did when I was in the hostage negotiations, one of the key things is humanize the victim. And I think the noise that we get and the way that social media or the internet and things it can very easily dehumanize, but we dehumanize on fractures and schisms like we've had from a British perspective. You've got Remainers and those who voted to leave. Then you've got the political divides in America and stuff. So it's very easy for us to then look at, and then you've got us and them from the immigrants and the people who aren't immigrants and stuff. So I think social media is very good at creating our identity, helping us identify with groups. What it then does is helps us dehumanize the other groups. And I think that is one of the key dangers we're having. We can get into a group that we identify with, it enables us to dehumanize anyone outside of that group, which I think is extraordinarily dangerous.
Scott, many years ago, I'll share this story. We came up with a really interesting analogy. I was studying at Duke in North Carolina, and over the weeks, one of the American guys, he said, "Yeah, there's this fast chicken place, fried chicken. This is the best stuff." And we wound ourselves up for weeks, and it was like a 3-hour drive away, and there was like 30 of us, and we all eventually said, "Okay, we're going to go to this awesome place that you've raved so much about." And we were hyped up, and we all got in cars and drove 3 hours there and expecting the most amazing thing. And when we got there, it was pretty bad. And we coined a phrase: it was an escalating commitment to a losing cause. And I think that is something that the world is becoming really good at, is escalating our emotional commitment. And actually, it's to a losing cause, quite frankly. Most of the times, it's to a losing cause. So it's just an interesting analogy that you.
I'd like to add to that. And whilst I'm going back in history, I met Nelson Mandela back in 1995, and I was very privileged to do that. I was working on a project at the time called the 1 in 10 House, and it was the telecommunication house for the disability. And the reason why I met him was because he stopped what he was doing to actually come over in his Versace shirt and shake my hand, and he wanted me to talk about the project. And it was, as I said, it was everything about the disability. And just to share with you that he had that compassion and that deep understanding of empathy, and he had big vision. And one thing Douglas has taught me, and he's taught me many things, but the one thing he has taught me is the word Ubuntu. And he's tried over the years to ingrain that into my DNA. It doesn't work very well when I'm wearing an All Blacks rugby shirt, but it does actually work most of the time. And I got to say, the Ubuntu is something that if we as the world could create a slower movement, and we could actually bring what Scott was saying in terms of these small groups and turning those small groups into bigger groups with Ubuntu, the world would be such a much better place.
Absolutely, Jeff. It goes to the heart of saying, surely if I make others a better version of themselves, you become a better version.
Khatam ho gaya na? We just had a mild earthquake, so everybody's just coming up and asking.
Yeah.
It's amazing how parts of the world, if that had happened in the UK, we'd have bricking ourselves by this point.
No, the last time it was pretty strong. It was pretty strong. This time it started shaking. I was just waiting for God forbid, the second one to come. The last one literally made the building go left and right. But Ubuntu is a very strong concept, Jeff. It's a strong concept. It's a very strong concept. I went to the US for a year. I spent a year in the US back in 97, 98. So like every decade, somehow we ended up in a different location. And in 97, 98, this was the toughest year of my life. It was the toughest year of my life simply because I went to a place in Rhode Island where in the entire year, I was only able to make 3 or 4 friends. These were people who were military kids who'd seen more of the world. They were more tolerant. They were like two or three of them are lifelong friends simply because at a time when I went there, they're only the American exposure to a large extent for somebody with my accent, which at that time wasn't neutral. It was more towards the British, because having spent my childhood in England, it was more that way. It would remind them of a character in a Simpsons cartoon called Apu. And Apu was a 7-Eleven store owner, and it didn't matter to them that I was speaking their language fluently, or that I was coming from a much better quality of life with the privileged background that I'd had in Pakistan. I went to a normal high school, and that was the toughest year because all I was dealing with was ignorance. Ignorance, which led to fear, which often resulted in mimicry and mockery. These 3 people who'd had more of an experience because their parents had been transferred all over the world, they were American kids, but they were really, really great people. I really believe, Jeff, when you say, and when Douglas, you say this also, yes, the world is connected. but we need to connect it in a way where the human experience of experiencing people from different backgrounds is really stressed upon. It's something that people get out and discover. Like Jeff could have been very, very reclusive and closed off, and I've had this privilege. Jeff, I don't know if you've met Garfield or not, but Garfield is a person who came to Pakistan. He's a Britisher, came to Pakistan. He used to work for Ridley Scott Associates, their executive producer. He was producing a commercial in Pakistan for the UN for the polio program, and he came to Pakistan and he just refused a big vehicle, an armored vehicle. And he said, no, we'll just try and be where you need us to be, in the type of exposure that you need us to be in. 2 visits down, he invested in my company. He'd only spent like 6-7 days with me, and he's literally grown into an elder brother for me. Like there's nothing in the world I wouldn't do for him. There's literally nothing in the world that I wouldn't do for him. Because what I realized was, it's not your background, it's not the color of your skin, it's not your religion. The world is very, very fully becoming polarized towards two kinds of people. One, the initiated and the tolerant, and the other, which are the uninitiated and the intolerant. The world has to come down. This divide, the gulf is becoming bigger and bigger. We've the more we've got people who are aspiring for bigger things, you will always see the Jeffs and the Fahads and the Douglases and the Scotts come together, because we realize we can be productive together. And then there are those who don't realize that this productivity can be unlocked. And then there's a very small, tiny population that feeds off this gulf. The media channels, like Douglas said, all of these new age media platforms, and they feed off of this under the garb of freedom of speech. Freedom of hate is being processed with freedom. I've never met you, Scott. I've interacted with Douglas. Jeff has been a very old friend. It didn't take a lot to have this friendship come about. It was brought together by shared ambition. It was the ambition to do good, to be good, and to help people who are trying to do good. It's all of this that has to work out. But there's this very small peck that feeds and keeps on creating this gulf.
That reminds me of something. I was talking to another guy called Scott, obviously a good guy because his name's Scott. He's a CEO, CEO of Trust Builder. I was talking to him, and it was about people who see the world, and it comes from negotiation background, the way I interpret this a little bit, but the zero-sum game. The zero-sum game where I look after myself at the expense of others and stuff. That is where distrust happens, because we try to protect what we've got. We see the world, and is a finite resource, and we've got to fight for our section. We either want to make it bigger or protect what we have. When trust happens is when we go beyond that, and we start, as you said, by a bit of forgiveness, but also then the olive tree. So we see the world as a slightly bigger, different place. And when we move from that area of looking after ourselves and seeing things as finite as a resource we've got to protect or to keep or to have, and move beyond that into externalizing that and building, what we would say in negotiation is make the pie bigger. Don't argue about the slice of the pie, just make the pie bigger.
I take that to one step level. I like the word acceptance, because if I look at anything that ever happened in my life, and my life hasn't always been easy, to say the least. Once I've accepted the circumstances, the energetic shift forward, and the ability to trust that my path forward. There's a great saying by Lazo which says the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and I've always believed that. And you just have this huge energetic shift, and it's a gut instinct of knowing. But it's when you get to acceptance, because when you accept the circumstances, you're not going back, you're going forward. And I think there's a lesson here for all of us. We can talk about courageous leadership, we can talk about energetic leadership, we can talk about all these other leadership nuances, but the ability to have the knowing to say we have to go forward, and we have to go forward is a trusting element within you. And I want to call it another one was intuitive leadership, but it's really the ability to go forward. And I said before, acceptance of the circumstances is the enabler for growth and going forward.
I think you
So
can.
Jeff,
Go on, sorry. Go on,
sorry, Scott. I have a very funny anecdote. You know how you go to a different organization for the first time and you wouldn't nobody knows you, nobody invites you for lunch, nobody has it takes time to gel in, right? So one of my friends really figured out a very nice way to have an icebreaker over there. What he would do is on his desk the very first day, he would buy a big packet of crisps, tear open the bag, put it in a plate, and keep it out there for anybody. Now, anybody, crisps is something that was always something that was enticing to people, right? It's a savory snack, you like it, and people invariably come in and they start a conversation. Do you know the Sufi way of life? This is exactly how they start, by feeding each other. I always
Sure.
imagined if I were to go and live anywhere else in the world, the first thing that I would do is try and have a meal for everybody on the street. Because those are the people that my children are going to grow up with. Those are the people that my family is
So,
going to spend time with.
so Fahd, if you go back into English history, okay, my grandfather was a part of that. Okay, in the 1920s, he set up the first biscuit factory for Huntley and Palmer's. It was a ritual that you would bring. And the reason why we have biscuit tins is because no one knows what biscuits are actually inside. And you would
Hmm.
always go to somebody's house with biscuits. In fact, it was only probably we abolished biscuits in the meeting room tables. Only a few companies now, when Doug and I go into the boardroom, do you actually
Hmm.
see a selection of biscuits on the table because they were the ability to start that conversation.
Hmm.
They initiated the conversation. But
Hmm.
of course,
Hmm.
they're like, oh no, we get rid of the biscuits. What they don't realize is, no disrespect, but I've been in Pakistan where it was Ramadan when everybody's drained at the table, but if you had biscuits there, it would get you through. But religious purposes, you're not
I,
allowed to do that, right? But you see, in England, we would have this ritual of biscuits, and biscuits was actually quite a nice thing. It was always a conversation starter, always.
I think
yeah.
it's what's
Hmm.
your favorite? That's a start, isn't it? What's your favorite one on the list?
Yeah, yeah.
Fighting for the best ones. That's what it is. Oh,
No, no, no. Can I have some more of the chocolate, please?
no, you're right.
Yeah,
Buddy.
always.
I'm not too fan of the chocolate ones. I like the other ones. So there you go. Douglas, what I'd just like to bring you in on, and it is, and I do apologise, I can never remember what this is. The phrase that you talk, Jeff, which is obviously a phrase from your childhood about that you said is the way of life. Jeff mentioned it, and
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu.
for
Ubuntu.
those of us, because you've explained it to me before, but those of us who are listening who have not heard it, would you mind explaining that concept? I know it's a word.
Yeah.
It doesn't translate into a word in English. It's more of a way of
Yeah,
thinking.
it's a very deep, as Fahd said, it's a very deep African proverb, and it talks about a couple of things. And Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, these were some of the South African icons and Nobel Peace Prize winners that led with this type of philosophy. And they literally led with this philosophy that says always keep the door ajar behind you for others, always bring others with you. And even if, as Jeff said, even if you walk slower, wait for those, but don't leave them behind, and you become stronger. And there's a wonderful analogy of a farmer and a competing farm next door. And with the wind, what happens is the wind will pick up the grain and the pollen, and it'll pollinize the farm. And so, when one farmer who has a very good and disciplined way of tending to his crops, and then on the other side you have a farmer who doesn't, and you go to the person who is a very good farmer and say, why do you do it? Why do you help your farmer next door? And he said, well, if I don't help him, his crops aren't going to be at the right standard, which will eventually affect my crops. And I think that's the philosophy of just inclusion of helping others without any expectation in return in terms of that. And I think this is the Fard mentioned it in that spirit of doing things where it's actually through kindness. You lead with kindness and empathy, and you don't expect anything in return because it's just the right thing to do. It brings people together, and so Ubuntu is very much that, around bringing everybody with you, going slower but bringing everybody with you, that they all benefit and they all enjoy. I think it's something that it's, of course, it's an African proverb, but I think it's a great philosophy in life that allows you to see the world differently. And there's a wonderful book that I've used in my executive mentorship in the past is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and that's a Austrian